Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of our E4 opening repertoire. So we discussed in the introduction some of the ways that Black can respond to our move 1 E4, and in this particular video we're going to focus in a bit more detail after what happens when our opponent plays E5. So the most common response, the response you're going to face most of the time when you play 1 E4 in your online or even over the board games. So here I advocated for playing the move order knight to c3, so this just stops any potential weird gambits that Black could potentially throw against you. And here, most likely or not, our opponent is going to continue the game knight to c6. Afterwards we will then move our other knight to f3, and in 90% of our games we will probably reach this position. This is our starting position, the 4 knights game. 4 knights, obviously the fact that there are 4 knights in the centre of the board, so nice straightforward position. We get our pieces out, we get castled, we achieve what we want to achieve in the opening. Remember, our 3 things that we want to achieve in the opening: we want to get our pieces out, control the centre, and also castle our king at some point. Okay, so going back, we're going to look through some particular moves that our opponent can play now, because our opponent might not always want to play ball. They might not always play the way that we want them to play, so that's always very important. And as I say, if your opponent does play some really weird moves, it's always important to remember those 3 things that I said: control the centre, get your pieces out, and castle. You can't go too much wrong against your opponent as long as you're doing that at the very least. So even at move 2, our opponent can play some different things. As I say, they don't have to play knight to c6 or knight to f6, which would most likely get into our particular position that we want to get into. Our opponent here could decide, if he wants to, and the third most popular choice, which is bishop to c5. And I don't think you need to worry too much about this in your games. They lead to a little bit of complications for Black, and I think White can probably get a slight edge out of most of the positions that you'll see. So here, against this bishop c5 idea, just play your other knight to f3, and this has the added benefit of now attacking this pawn on e5. So they've got to do something about that, maybe playing pawn to d6 or even knight to c6 here. If they play a move like knight to f6, well, White can get probably a slight edge here now after just capturing this pawn. And it's a little bit difficult for Black to reclaim this pawn. He would love to just take here, but obviously this knight is here, so he can't really do that. So Black will have to play a bit of a tricky move order now. Maybe play bishop to d4 with the idea of capturing this knight, which defends this pawn and also threaten this other knight. So here we just retreat your knight back to f3, which now attacks the bishop. At this point, Black will most likely capture, so try and reclaim this pawn. But after they reclaim this pawn, well, after bishop to d3, we now hit this knight, and we don't really want to play moves like, let's say, d5 here now, as well. I mean, the best move here is you could probably just capture here actually, and then swap off these queens, in which case you can create this potential fork along here. And against f5 is probably the other move here. Again, you can probably just capture off here. Well, the best move according to the engine is just queen to e7. But if they, let's say, capture this way, you can create a really, really nice position. Now you'll see this queen is totally trapped here. So they probably won't play that. So instead, after this, they'll most likely move back to f6. After which you play queen to e2, and there's a really awkward position now for Black. What does he do with his king? If he moves it to f8, well, he can no longer castle. We can probably happily say he's got a nice edge in this position. This rook is going to have a very difficult time to get into the game, and we've got more pieces developed. We're going to have an easy game, which is castling, getting our bishop out, or whatever. But the other move that they could play is queen to e7, and well, let's be honest, it probably leads to probably just as bad position as after the exchange of queens. This king can no longer castle. White's going to have a nice simple position here. He's going to get his bishop maybe to g5, castle, and get his rooks to these lovely open files. And I think White can definitely say he's got a nice position from here, even though he's got this potential double pawn weakness, which might be a bit of a long-term weakness for him. But in the opening, he seems to have done absolutely fine. No issues here. So going back then. So they can't really do a move like this. So instead, you're probably going to see the move d6 played against you. And this has just a simple idea of holding on to this pawn that was attacked and also helping defend this bishop. And against this, I'm going to give you a little crafty move order here now, and that is playing the move knight to a4. Bit of a weird move. Obviously, we're taught not to move the pieces twice in the opening, but here it comes with a simple threat. We're going to take off this bishop and get rid of the bishop pair. Now when I say the bishop pair, I'm talking about these two guys here. Generally in chess, if we can try and swap off our knights for bishops, knights are maybe slightly worse than bishops in most positions, and in this particular position, if we can swap off the bishop, we can maybe say we've got a slight edge, as I think most theoreticians might say that bishops are probably worth maybe half a point more than a knight. So just a little interesting thing. Obviously we're taught the two pieces are about 3 each, but most people will say that the bishops are worth probably slightly more. Okay, so here Black could continue bishop to b6. Again, if they do something else, let's say, I know they just develop a piece here, we just swap off here and we can be absolutely happy with this. We've now inflicted double pawns on Black, and also we've got rid of the bishop pair, so we'll be happy with this. And in the other position, if let's say they move this knight back to b6, which you'll most likely see here, just take off here, and okay, Black has got double pawns here. I guess he's got this open file, which is a little bit of a compensation as a result, but he's got a permanent weakness here, so he's always going to have to worry about going into endgames, because these at some point later on will become a weakness and a target for us to attack later on. The reason why double pawns are weak is because these two pawns are quite difficult to move together. They don't defend each other, they kind of stumble all over each other, and they just create weaknesses and targets for us to attack. So that's why we perhaps consider them in some positions to be quite weak. Okay, so a nice simple continuation here. You can maybe just play d4, take the center, take control of everything. After this, e takes d4, which you'll probably see in most of your beginner games. Actually, a nice, funny continuation, just capturing with the queen here now. And Black would love to play c6 here, hitting the queen, but you'll notice that this pawn on g7 is under attack, so they can't do that, so they most likely have to play knight to f6, after which you can play bishop to g5. You've got your pieces out, you're creating lots of threats here now, so already we've got a potential threat of doubling up some more pawns and creating more targets for us to attack. So here Black will most likely have to play here, and after bishop b5, which now has a threatening to capture this this defender and then also destroy the pawn structure. I'll stop the position here, but I think White's absolutely fine. He's going to be castling pretty much next move and get an absolutely fine position here, in my opinion. So this would be, I would be quite happy if you had this in a game. You've got no issues whatsoever. You've got all your pieces out. You're controlling the center. I think White is doing absolutely fine here. So that'll be what will happen if that bishop came there. The final move to maybe consider in this bishop c5 line is what will happen after knight to c6, and I think this is the most interesting continuation as there's a nice little trap involved in it. So here, if knight came to c6, you can capture here on e5 anyway, and you may be thinking, well, I'm just losing a knight here, so what's so good about this? Well, after knight captures, you've got this lovely fork with d4, so you see here these two pieces are now attacked. And well, the only move here that White can really play is bishop to d6 to avoid any loss. If he just captures his pawn, well, we're absolutely happy with this as we now reclaim our piece. We're now hitting this queen, we're winning a pawn here, so there's probably no need to continue down this line any further. So after bishop here, which maintains the material imbalance. I think here that white is doing absolutely fine here. He's going to maybe move his bishop to d3, play moves like castles. f4 would be a nice particular break that we can go for, and really claim a lot of space in the center and start a kingside attack potentially as well. So this would be absolutely fine as well. Black, on the other hand, will probably at some point butcher your pawn structure here, which, okay, is not brilliant for us, but if this pawn ever goes, we can then potentially move this bishop onto the this diagonal here, where it can influence this game. So, you know, pawn, double pawns, okay, sometimes they're at disadvantage. I think in this position they're not actually too bad here. They give you some dynamic pluses as well, and in this particular situation, although we got poor pawn structure, we actually get very good piece activity. So I'll just show an example continuation, maybe something like bishop to d3, so defending this pawn, knight to f6, attacking the pawn, castles, f4, so creating our kingside expansion and lovely control of all these squares. So now hitting this bishop, so forcing this exchange off. And now here, I think white's doing absolutely fine here. He's got potential ideas of either moving his bishop along this diagonal, so coming to d2, e3, or even coming onto a3 and hitting along this diagonal potentially. So I think I don't really want to continue too much more on this line, but I think white is doing absolutely fine. Okay, so going back then to our main position. So that's why I don't think you need to worry too much about this bishop c5 idea. It's probably the only main sort of sideline you're going to see in these positions. The other move you could face is d6, and this will actually transpose into a normal Vienna like position. So there's another position called the Vienna game, and this will just kind of go into that main line. So after knight to f3, knight to f6, you can play the move d4 here now, which I think is absolutely fine, so taking control of the center. And I think the main problem with this d6 idea is, although it's solid, it protects this pawn here on e5, it does at the cost of hemming in this bishop on f8. So black's going to have a slightly more cramped position. You're going to have a bit more space in this position, and space allows you to move your pieces around a bit more freely. You can maybe start an attack on one side and switch over, and it's much easier for you to do that when you've got more space, as your opponent will have a bit of tough time trying to maneuver stuff around if he's got a bit of a cramped position. It can be tough to get over to one side and then back over to the other if he's got a space disadvantage. So I think this is absolutely fine. Another way to play is you could play bishop to c4 here as another option as well, and here after bishop e7, maybe play d4 now, knight b to d7. This transposes into a normal Vienna game position, but I think white's got a nice edge here. He's got good control of the center, he's got lovely placed pieces, they're all placed where we like them to be. We've got ideas of maybe coming with our bishop to g5, maybe rook to e1 to protect our e4, e1 pawn, and I think white's doing absolutely fine here. I don't think there's any real issues in his position whatsoever. Okay, so going back then, as I say, we don't need to worry too much about some of the sideline options. As I say, 90% of your games, you're going to just get this position, and I think white should do absolutely fine here. So I spoke about just in our introduction video playing the move bishop to b5, so this is going to be our main starting position, but there are two other little sidelines I do want to show you if you want to play a different game. One way you can play is with the move g3. I think this is called the Gleck system, but I could be wrong here. I think that might be a different opening, and it's got no name on the Lee Chess database or the chess.com database, so let me know if you know what this is. This just has the idea of moving our bishop to g2 and then castling, and this long diagonal will be, you basically want to try and control all these light squares in the center because you've got this lovely long diagonal for the bishop. The only thing I don't like about this position is that this bishop, by moving it to g2, you're kind of trapping it behind your pawn here. So you'll need to at some point try and open up this position to allow this bishop to roam freely along this diagonal. Right now it's trapped behind its own pawn, so that's probably the only reason why I don't like those positions too much. The other move that you can play is d4, and this is known as the 4 knights Scotch variation. Very popular amongst grandmasters, been a very trendy line in recent times. It kind of came back into fashion in the 90s, and it's been picking up a lot of steam in recent games. I'm just looking on my database. We've got games from Hikaru Nakamura, Carlsen has played it, Vladimir Kramnik has played it, so quite trendy amongst the grandmasters. The idea of playing this way is it stops some potential tricky lines that you could face in normal Scotch game variations. So the Scotch game looks slightly different. So something like this and this and this. So this is your normal Scotch game position, and it just stops any potential tricky lines that you could face with things like Queen to H4, Bishop to C5, Bishop to B4 as well. So it's a way of just trying to avoid a bit of theory, but as I say, both lines are absolutely fine. I'm just sorry it gets this way. Yeah. So both will. I think this D4 idea is absolutely fine as well. You get into nice Scotch positions here. And I would recommend, if you want to look at those, have a look online. There's some few good videos on the 4 knight Scotch variation. Okay, so let's go to our mainline position. So bishop to b5. Okay, so this is our idea. We are now potentially threatening to capture this knight on c6. And then take on e5. So that's our immediate threat. And well, if they play a move like a6, I think white is going to get a nice advantage. You might face this quite a lot, because although it looks quite similar to a Ruy Lopez, and your opponent might get sort of confused and play like a6. If you see this, you should be absolutely happy, as you can now capture here on c6. After d takes, you can take this knight quite normally now, and there are some tricky lines here, but white should remain a pawn up. So the tricky line goes knight takes an e4, you capture back, and then d4, creating this fork on this knight. And here just give up one of your knights, it's fine, you're still up in this position. So after castles and then queen takes on e5, I think white should be absolutely happy in this position. He doesn't need to worry about this knight potentially falling, as you've always got this lovely pin along this file. So in actual fact, most games have continued with either d4 or even just rook to e1, and you've already got some threats here of moving this knight and then creating this beautiful pin on this king. So I think you'd be absolutely happy to go into that variation. I think you're actually still up a pawn, in fact. Oh no, so the material is equal in this position after this, but I guess you've got this double pawn target that you can go for. You should be absolutely happy. I think white would be really the only one who can probably be playing for some slight edge or even a win in this position. Okay, so going back then, so you might face this quite a lot. And in that case just capture here, but there are two main lines that you're most likely faced in most of your positions. So you can either play the symmetrical move bishop to b4, very logical, maintaining the symmetry and trying to create the same threats that you are here, so capturing here and then taking this pawn on e4. And then there's one other line that is actually quite tricky, and that's the move knight to d4. I'll focus on that one second, as there's some little tricky lines here that you'll need to be aware of. So let's firstly look at this bishop b4 idea. Okay, so similar thing here, maintaining symmetry and creating the same threats that you are. In here, in this situation, I would now just castle, and most likely black will maintain the symmetry, castle as well. Very logical, get our king safe, out of the centre, get our rooks into play. d3, getting our bishop ready to come out to g5, and d6. So again, maintaining the symmetry. And you know, if your opponent plays this way, you know, I think you can still be quite happy with a slight edge, as well you're always a move ahead from your opponents, and you should have a good game here. So now this is where it gets quite interesting. So if you played a move bishop to g5, which now has this potential threat of moving the knight here to d5, attacking this knight and creating all kinds of problems for black on the king side that I discussed in the introduction. If our opponent now continues the symmetry with bishop to g4, well, you'll actually find that black is going to be in a slightly losing position now, as after bishop captures here, and let's just say he maintains the symmetry, this is going to be no good for black, as now after queen captures, okay, let's say he captures back here, we'll be the one that will be inflicting the problems for black here, as after queen captures and this captures, okay, you might not want to be too comfortable exchanging queens, but we've achieved a imbalance here. We've now got these double pawns. Black's king side is totally shattered, so his kings are slightly unsafe here. We can continue mangling black's pawn structure with bishop takes and b takes, and now we've got plenty of targets to go after, so I'd be happy to go into an endgame like this. We would start trying to maneuver our pieces around and then start finding ways to take off these pawns. So absolutely happy with the decision. I mean, even ideas of just moving the knight here, playing moves like f4 would be one idea, and then look to try and, I guess, even just fix these pawns and then maneuver our rooks around and create some problems for black on the king side. So I think you should be absolutely happy with these sort of positions if you do get that. So that'll be happen if they maintain the symmetry here. Another way that they could play is after you capture here, they could in fact capture with the queen here, and again I think you should be even happier with this position, as now you can play knight to d5. You're now forking the c7 pawn and the queen, so the only good move here is actually moving back with your queen to d8, after which you can then create this capture here and actually remove the defender of this bishop, and then capture here, and you're totally ahead in this position. Should do absolutely fine now. Although that's interesting, actually, you can play this and then okay, you can take here on c6 and you're fine then. So I think actually this knight still gets lost, but in actual fact we've taken so many pawns that it doesn't matter. So after this, in actual fact, white emerges 2 pawns ahead here. So that's just something to bear in mind in that continuation. Okay, so going back. So absolutely happy if you do that. So that's why they really can't maintain the symmetry. So in this position, instead of bishop to g4, what they'll need to do, because they've obviously got to think about this threat as well, of knight coming to d5, they'll most likely capture on c3. And if they do this, okay, that's fine. We capture b takes on c3, and really we should still be happy in these sort of positions. These double pawns, by the way, aren't all that bad for us, as these double pawns will actually help us support the center. So when we're ready, we want to be pushing d4 as soon as possible, and then strike over the center. If they ever capture, we then undouble our pawns and we get a nice strong control of the center. So I'll give you just a sample position. This was from a game that was played between two 2600 Grandmasters. So the game continued queen to e7. I guess this has the idea of helping control the e5 square, because at some point black will want to be pushing this d5 pawn forward. Obviously he can't do that because of this potential bishop captures at some point, which will remove the defense of the e5 square. The rook came to e1, similar idea, supporting the e4 square. Knight came to d8, and this had the idea of coming back to d8 to then go to e6. And this is quite instructive in Grandmaster games. You know, once they've developed everything and they've got into the middle game, an easy plan to come up with is just to keep trying to look for ways to improve your pieces. So that's very important in middle game idea. If there's no threats around, if there's no checkmate stuff, just look for ways to improve your pieces. And here black elects to go back to d8. It looks a bit funny, but he's going to be maneuvering to e6, which he considers to be a much better square to go to, because as you can see, it's hitting the bishop and it's giving itself a much more active role in the center as well. So d4 was played, so now undoubling these pawns, which is an important theme that we need to go for. And notice here actually, the reason why we've got this rook here is it stops this knight now from capturing on here, although obviously there's a pin here. But we played this preparatorial move first to allow us to push on d4. Knight came to e6, hitting the bishop. Bishop came back to d2, absolutely safe here. It's now helping defend our c3 pawn. In this position, the rook came to d8, bishop came to d3, and then knight came to f8, so it tried to reroute itself. And again, black is just trying to maneuver his pieces around to get to good squares. If the knight can get to this lovely f4 square, I think it's doing absolutely fine. Knight came to h4, and white is now rerouting his knight to this lovely f5 square, which is just as good as the f4 square. c5 was played, queen to f3, so getting ready to jump a knight in here. h6 was played, and then the knight came to this f5 square. And after a couple captures, I'm going to stop the position here. White actually has emerged with a nice edge in this position. With this pawn, he'll be looking to create some lovely kingside attacks, and he's got these lovely placed bishops which can jump into the position at any point. White, the game continued, I think another sort of looks like actually about 25 moves, but white developed a lovely kingside attack and was able to win this position. So just a nice sample game of what to do in potential plans that you can come up with in these positions. Okay, so going back then to the start. So I think you'll be absolutely fine if they follow symmetrically. As I say, this is the mainline position. You know, you can just get your pieces out to good squares. You've got potential threats here already, and black is going to be, you're creating all the problems for black in these positions. You know, they have to be the one reacting to your threats all the time, and I think white's going to probably get a slight edge, even though, you know, the computers say there's probably just a nice equal position. And even then, actually, I think even a nice equal position is absolutely fine for yourself as well, as you're always playing with one move ahead. Okay, so going back. So the other move that I wanted to show you, and is a little bit trickier, but I think white can still emerge absolutely fine out of the positions. So the other move that's a little bit tricky is knight to d4. And you might be looking at this guy, and this is a bit weird. Surely he's wasted a move to try and get, you know, attack, just do a simple little threat like this. What's the harm of this move? Surely we're taught not to move the same pieces twice in the opening. What's going on here? What's going on here? Well, just very quickly, we don't really want to play the move knight takes on e5. I think black does absolutely fine here after queen to e7. There's a bit too much pressure down here, so I wouldn't be too happy with this. Weirdly enough, actually, there have been quite a few Grandmaster games from this. Yu Yang Yi has played 2 games from this particular position. To each their own. If you want to play this way, absolutely happy, but I think it gets a little bit unnecessarily complicated. Another way that you could play, but I would only recommend you play this way if, let's say, you're looking to try and get a draw out of the position. So let's say you're playing in some sort of team match where maybe a draw is needed to win the match or something, or you're playing up against a much stronger opponent than you and you need maybe a draw to win a tournament or whatever, then I would recommend you capture this knight. But afterwards, white's not going to really get any advantage here. So after e takes, now hitting this knight, we can now play the move knight to pawn to e5, now hitting his knight, and after a couple of captures, queen takes an f6, you then capture back on c3, and here, well, the position has really petered out into pretty much an end game. There have been about 400 games from this position in the Masters database. Pretty much every single one of them has ended in the draw, so it's not the most ambitious way to play as white. With white, we kind of want to be playing for a win, so we shouldn't be be happy to settle for draws. But most of the games, as I say, they've continued with queen to e5 check, queen to e2 after queen captures and this captures. This is just a pure ending. I actually think black's probably slightly better as he's got no pawn weaknesses here. We're the ones with the pawn weaknesses. So if anything, black is probably the one that's looking to play for a win, but it's very difficult for either side to really get anything from this position as, well, both sides are pretty equal. There's not really too much to play with, and yeah, I mean, you can probably just offer the draw draw handshake at this point, but you know, it could be still interesting if you want to learn maybe in games or something. This might be an interesting position to go into. Right, so going back. Then, so that's one way to play, and I wouldn't recommend that. The most popular way to play is actually bishop to a4, and this just has the simple intention of, okay, you've wasted the move, but I'm going to keep my bishop on a4. I'm now threatening to capture on e5. Now, what are you going to do about it? This knight, what's the whole point of this knight to d4 idea? Okay, and again, you know, they could take here on f3 if you wanted to, and I think you'd be absolutely happy with this position. There's no issues in your position now. But the main line goes bishop to c5 now, and here we've got to be very precise in what we play here. So when you see this sort of structure, this knight coming to d4, bishop to c5, the rule here is now capture on e5. Oops, not this move. Capture on e5. There we go. And you've just got to be a bit precise here. So after castles, which is most likely played, you now play knight to d3, and this will now hit this bishop. This bishop has to move as it's going to be captured next move. So most likely they'll go maybe bishop to b6. So getting it out of the way, and after this you can now play the move e5, and this comes with an added problem for black as there's no space for this knight to go to. You see here all these squares are now taken, so maybe knight to e8, and the positions here are really interesting. It's been reached, as I say, about 200 times in the Masters database. There's been quite a lot of draws from this position, which makes me think that this is quite an even line, but I find it very difficult. I mean, the computers say it's totally even in this position, and I find that hard to believe as, well, white's got you know, an extra pawn here. I wouldn't say he's got too many issues in this position, but the problem for white here is at some point he's going to need to reroute all his pieces because they're not on the best squares possible. You know, these two knights are blocking in our final comrade stuck on c1 here, so we'd love to get this this bishop out somehow. But I think white gets a nice straightforward position. He's just going to castle normally. He might be looking to do ideas of knight to d5 followed by knight to e3 at some point, and that's been reached in quite a lot of the different games. But as I say, I don't think white is in massive danger here. He certainly will be the one trying to go for the win because he's up a pawn, but don't be too afraid to even give back the pawn to try and stop some of black's activity, because obviously we're going to be spending a bit of time trying to get our pieces moving back into the right squares. Black's going to get quite an active position as a result, but as I say, I think this is a totally fine position to go into. You're up a pawn. I can't see too much wrong. You're going to get your pieces out and you're going to get a nice position here. Okay, so that's what to do in both the mainline positions. So as I say, you know, you're going to be hopefully getting to this position, our four knights position. Afterwards we want to do bishop to b5, and we've got two lines. The symmetrical I think you should do absolutely fine against. You should have no issues. Just get your pieces developed. d3, bishop g5, you should be absolutely fine here. And then in the case of the trickier line, knight to d4, at this point we play bishop to a4, and we've now got threats of capturing here on e5 and going for that precise move order. I think both lines you should be absolutely happy to play with. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. As I say, I think what my best advice to you for trying out these games or trying out these openings is practice a little bit in blitz first, just so you get the idea of the move orders, and I think from there just experiment a little bit. Try different plans, try different ideas, and you know, have a look through some of the Masters games to give you some ideas about some of the middle game plans that you could come across in the Spanish, sorry, not the 4-night game. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you managed to get to the end of this video, well done. If you can leave a like at some point and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, as this will give you some more notifications about any future videos that I publish in the future. Hope you enjoy this, guys, and I'll speak to you later. Bye.